Look at a pepper plant that has not produced a single flower in nearly 3 weeks. The leaves are dark green. The stems are thick. New growth keeps appearing. By now, most gardeners expect blossoms. Instead, every morning brings the same disappointment. No buds, no flowers, no peppers. Now look at that same plant 10 days after receiving a simple $2 brew. Flower buds crowd the upper nodes. Fresh white blossoms open across multiple branches. Areas covered in leaves just days earlier now look ready to set fruit. Right beside it sits another pepper plant. Same variety, same bed, same growing conditions. Yet it's still doing the same thing. Making leaves, growing taller, producing 0 flowers. At first glance, the difference feels impossible. But this isn't gardening folklore. Similar results were reported often enough that inexpensive starter brews became part of extension recommendations for pepper growers for decades. Not a rumor, not wishful thinking, documented observations. And one detail kept experienced growers paying attention. Pepper plants don't start flowering simply because they get bigger. So what was hidden inside this forgotten $2 mixture that convinced so many gardeners it was worth using? And if extension services trusted it enough to recommend it, why did those recommendations slowly disappear? That forgotten answer is where this story begins. The easiest explanation is that the brew never worked. But that explanation creates a problem. If it didn't work, why did extension services recommend it for decades? Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and much of the 70s, starter solutions were standard advice for vegetable transplants, including peppers. Growers were encouraged to mix inexpensive concentrated fertilizers into water and apply them at planting time. The goal was simple: help young plants establish faster, recover from transplant stress sooner, reach production earlier. This wasn't a fringe gardening trick. It was mainstream gardening guidance, and for many growers, the results looked convincing. Plants recovered faster, growth resumed sooner. And in some gardens, flowering seemed to arrive earlier than expected. Then the gardening world changed. By the 1980s, extension services were under increasing pressure to make recommendations that worked across thousands of gardens, soil types, climates, and growing conditions. That created a problem for starter brews. They might help in one garden, do very little in another, and occasionally create nutrient imbalances in a third. From an extension perspective, soil testing was easier to defend. Standardized fertilizer programs were easier to teach. Universal recommendations were easier to scale. So the old starter brews slowly disappeared from many extension publications. Not because they were proven useless, but because newer systems were more predictable. The recommendation faded away. The observation did not. Gardeners kept reporting the same strange pattern. A pepper plant appears stalled. A starter brew is applied. Days later, flower buds begin to appear. Again and again, the story repeated itself. Over time, gardeners remembered the result, but forgot the reason the recommendation existed in the first place. And that matters, because modern science now suggests those growers may have been seeing a real response all along, just not for the reason they thought. So the question is no longer whether the brew worked. The real question is what it was actually doing inside the plant. And that answer begins with one of the biggest misunderstandings in pepper gardening. What truly causes a pepper plant to start flowering? Here's the surprising part. The old growers were probably right and wrong at the same time. They were right about the result. They were wrong about the explanation. For decades, gardeners believed the starter brew was forcing pepper plants into flowering. A plant appeared stalled. The brew was applied. Buds appeared shortly afterward. The conclusion seemed obvious. The phosphorus must have triggered the flowers. Modern research suggests the story is far more complicated. Pepper plants don't always stop growing when they appear stalled. In many cases, they're simply working where gardeners can't see. Below the soil, especially after transplanting, pepper plants often redirect energy into root development. From above, the plant looks inactive. Below ground, it's building the foundation that future flowering depends on. And this is where many gardeners make an expensive mistake. The moment a pepper plant appears stalled, they reach for more fertilizer, more nutrients, more feeding, more intervention. But modern evidence suggests high phosphorus fertilizers do not directly force flowering in most garden soils. Their greatest benefit appears when a genuine phosphorus deficiency exists, and that's less common than many gardeners assume. Then, researchers uncovered another surprise. Part of the famous response may not have come from the nutrients alone. Modern extension analysis suggests the water used to deliver the brew may have played a significant role in the results growers were seeing. Think about what that means. Some gardeners may have credited the fertilizer when the plant was actually responding to improved moisture during a critical recovery period. Others may have been correcting a nutrient limitation. Others may simply have been helping a stress transplant regain momentum. Different gardens, different causes, the same visible result. And once you understand that, a much bigger question appears. If stalled pepper plants are often being treated for the wrong problem, what are the specific mistakes that keep them trapped in endless leaf growth while flowers never arrive? If there's one mistake that keeps stalled pepper plants stalled, it's this: misdiagnosing the problem. Mistake number one is assuming every stall is caused by a nutrient deficiency. A pepper plant stops producing flowers. Growth seems to slow. Nothing appears to change for days. The immediate reaction is to feed it. But many pepper plants that look stalled are still working hard below ground. Roots are expanding. The plant is establishing itself. What looks like inactivity is often preparation. When gardeners assume every pause is a deficiency, they end up treating a problem that may not exist. Mistake number two is reaching for a stronger brew. This is where things often get worse. The logic sounds reasonable. If a little helps, more should help even more. But concentrated fertilizer solutions raise salt levels around the roots. As those salts build up, water becomes harder for the plant to absorb. In severe cases, roots struggle to take in moisture even when the soil is wet. The plant begins acting like it's in a drought while surrounded by water. And flower buds are often among the first things sacrificed. Mistake number three is treating Epsom salt as a cure-all. This may be one of the most persistent pepper-growing myths ever passed from gardener to gardener. Many people use Epsom salt to increase flowering, strengthen plants, even prevent blossom end rot. But here's the catch. Excess magnesium can compete with calcium uptake. So a gardener trying to solve a calcium-related problem may accidentally make calcium transport more difficult. The solution becomes part of the problem. Mistake number four happens after sunset, and most gardeners never see it. The afternoon feels perfect. The plants look healthy. The soil is moist. Everything appears fine. But pepper plants are surprisingly sensitive to cool night temperatures. When nights stay too cold, flower development slows. Pollen viability drops. Fruit set becomes unreliable. Meanwhile, gardeners keep adding nutrients while the real limitation has nothing to do with fertility at all. Notice the pattern. Every mistake comes from treating the symptom instead of identifying the obstacle. And that's exactly why the forgotten starter brew became so popular. The growers who reported success weren't necessarily feeding more nutrients. In many cases, they were solving the right problem at exactly the right moment. Which brings us to the question most gardeners really want answered. What was actually in the original brew? And how were extension services instructing growers to use it when these recommendations were still official? So what was the forgotten brew that extension services recommended for pepper growers for decades? The formula was surprisingly simple. A soluble high-phosphorus starter fertilizer commonly sold as 10-52-17. The standard mixing rate was precise: 2 level tablespoons per gallon of water, not 3, not 4. 2. The application instructions were just as specific: At planting time, roughly half a pint of the solution was poured directly into the transplant hole or around the base of each pepper plant. Simple, consistent, easy to follow. But here's the detail most gardeners never heard. The Brew was never originally promoted as a flowering booster. It was promoted as a transplant starter. That distinction changes everything. In fact, some extension recommendations instructed growers to apply the solution 48 to 72 hours before transplanting. Think about that. The plant wasn't even in the garden yet. The goal wasn't to force flowers. The goal was to help the young plant enter one of the most stressful periods of its life with readily available nutrients already in place. In other words, the famous Brew wasn't designed to trigger blooming. It was designed to improve establishment. And a plant that establishes faster often reaches every later stage faster as well, including flowering. Modern gardeners often view the Brew as a rescue treatment for plants that seem stuck halfway through the season. The original recommendation was almost the opposite. One application, one critical moment, one specific purpose. Help the transplant recover and resume growth as quickly as possible. Notice what's missing from the historical instructions. No weekly applications. No repeated drenches. No instructions to keep feeding until flowers appeared. No promises of explosive blooming. And extension services included an important warning. More was not better. Excess fertilizer concentrations could raise salt levels around the roots, interfere with water uptake, and create the very stress gardeners were trying to avoid. That's the lesson hidden inside this forgotten recommendation. The growers who reported success weren't necessarily forcing pepper plants to flower. They were helping young plants overcome one of the most stressful transitions in their entire life cycle. And that explains why some gardeners saw dramatic results, while others saw almost none at all. The Brew wasn't changing the rules of plant biology. It was giving some plants a better start. And that difference can echo through the entire growing season. A final word about expectations, because this is where honest gardening advice matters most. The forgotten starter Brew was never a magic formula. It was never guaranteed to force flowers onto every pepper plant, and it was never capable of solving every reason a plant might stall. If cool night temperatures are the problem, the Brew can't change the weather. If roots have been damaged, it can't instantly rebuild them. If the soil already contains everything the plant needs, the response may be minimal. That helps explain why gardeners reported such different results. Some saw dramatic improvement. Others noticed only modest changes. And some saw almost no difference at all. The growers who benefited most were often using the Brew at exactly the right moment. During transplanting, when young plants were recovering from stress, establishing roots, and trying to resume active growth. That's the lesson worth remembering. Not that a forgotten fertilizer somehow forced nature to obey, but that healthy flowering begins long before the first bud appears. It begins with strong root establishment, stress recovery, favorable conditions, and removing the obstacles that prevent a plant from progressing naturally. In a way, the old growers and modern researchers were pointing toward the same truth. The observation was real. The explanation simply became more accurate over time. And if you think back to the 2 pepper plants we started with, the real difference may never have been the Brew itself. It may have been that one plant received the right support at the right moment, while the other continued struggling against an obstacle no fertilizer could solve. That's what this story has really been about. Not forcing flowers. Understanding plants. The Brew was forgotten. The lesson behind it shouldn't be. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten gardening wisdom, hidden soil biology, and the surprising science behind observations gardeners have trusted for generations, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we explore the living systems beneath the soil, the methods older gardeners relied on, and the research helping us understand why those methods sometimes worked so well. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever tried a starter brew like this on peppers or other vegetables? What happened? Share your experience in the comments below. Your observations may help another gardener solve a problem no fertilizer bag can explain. Until next time, keep watching what your garden is trying to tell you.